forward. We're talking about social change, economic change, political change. In dealing with this next concept, the point I was making is that there's more, it's a more complex argument to understand historically. It's the equivalent from checkers to chess, right? Is that economics is pretty direct. Here we're talking about a change in the perspective of Americans because of the world around them. And when putting it into some sort of context, we're talking about progressivism. One of the things, unfortunately, we have to deal with is contemporary political partisanship. And I just wanted to make sure and be clear about that. That historians, when historians talk about progressivism, they're talking about this period of time when everyone, or at least the leading, when we get to the 1912 election, there's socialists running, there's Democrats running, there are Republicans running. All of them call themselves progressives. The overwhelming majority of Americans who are going to vote for progressive candidates. Texas is a progressive state. So it's a warning to not get caught up in the 2012 ideology. You're more than welcome to it. And I understand how partisan passions get flamed and all that kind of stuff. But don't confuse contemporary terms for what historians are focusing on in regards to this period of time. And what I did last time was to try and step through some examples about why that is. Right? The world has changed. We can fly now. We're driving around in automobiles. Theorists in all kinds of professions, journalism, the sciences, medicine, are all making discoveries and making observations about a modern world. And an old view, an old worldview, sort of a Gilded Age worldview, would look at this and say, oh, I'm not comfortable with this. I'm not comfortable with the way in which the United States is moving forward. This generation is going to get past it. This generation is not going to be concerned about industrial capitalism as our economic system as maybe their older siblings or parents were during the 1880s and 1890s. So when we talk about progressivism, we're talking about an issue that is going to dominate the 20th century. George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan are progressives. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama are progressives, historically defined progressives. Right? And that gets confused a little bit by the contemporary political debates, which we can just set aside. Right? The reason why it's important to you, don't bury the lead on me, is that this question of progressivism is going to be on every essay question that you are going to have to answer for the next exam. Restated, you can't avoid answering the question, what is progressivism? Right? Because of its historical importance, because of the way in which it's going to define the next 118 years of American history. All right, so what is it? One of the things I left off with last time was the sense of a new perspective, of a sense of optimism. Not optimism, I'm going to go buy a lottery ticket and live in luxury, but an optimism that I would imagine everyone in this room shares. I can control my own future. I live in a world where there are big corporations and these big impersonal forces, but I am confident that I can manage my own life within the context of these changes. Right? The populists wanted to get rid of them. Populists wanted to push back and say, no, we're going too far too fast. Progressivism largely is saying, how do we live in this world? How do we live in this kind of reality? And I started talking about the three main types and introduced the first one, and the most diverse one, social gospel progressives. And I made the point that one of the leading forces of this movement are going to be active theologians, people who have taken their religious faith and have applied it to contemporary society. It's sort of ironic that everyone has heard of that phrase, what would Jesus do, but don't know where it comes. It comes from the progressive movement. And the argument is not to run candidates for office. The argument isn't to make politicians, swear that they're upholding the Bible or, the Torah or any kind of religion. The idea is to use the same logic behind religious thinking for dealing with social problems. That's what would Jesus do? That phrase is a progressive phrase. Right? It's saying, in essence, that what we need to do is to apply our thinking process, our morality, to the reality that people face. And what social gospel progressives do, and we're going to see, they are the most diverse. Right? When you can put the National Rifle Association and the Sierra Club in the same group, they're both social gospel progressive groups. Right? That is a very diverse kind of range of political partisans. What do? Social gospel progressives see a problem for the first time, They organize an interest group to try and deal with that problem, and then try to change the environmental conditions, the reality that is going to create the problem that they're looking at. All right, so one of the things that's very clear about this group is that they're going to be activists. They're going to organize. They're going to try and put pressure on politicians and businesses and labor groups, etc. They're not political candidates. They're not going to run for a political party, but they're going to influence political organization in a big way. All right, so I'm going to step through this group at the beginning, and I'll use some examples. And again, one of the things you're going to see is that I would imagine every major in this room is going to start appearing, right? If it wasn't Einstein, Freud, and engineering, we're going to probably get to your major at some point in time as we go through this. The first one, journalism. Right? Up until this point in time, when you think of most of the political or any kind of reporting, it was partisan. There was a Republican paper, there was a Democrat paper. And if you were a Republican or a Democrat, that's the paper you read. The idea behind modern journalism is to do what? Is to investigate and to explain in something of an objective manner. Right? Again, in contemporary society, we're going back to more of the partisan. You know, if you're a conservative, you listen to such and such radio. If you're a liberal, you listen to such and such radio. But by and large, in the progressive era, the argument was that journalism could expose incongruities, problems in a modern society, and lay these out for the American public to what? To read and to assess. These are monthly or weekly magazines. Who's consuming these? Working poor? Immigrants? No. These are mostly being consumed by college-educated, middle-class Americans. Those are the ones who are going to be responding to this. They're reading these arguments. They're looking at these essays. Ida Tarbell, perfect example. Right? Of someone who's doing what? She investigates the oil industry. And she lays out the argument that, in essence, what Rockefeller is doing isn't increasing competition. He's not in helping capitalism. What he's doing is he's driving competition out of the marketplace. If you want to start a new oil firm because you got a better idea or you got a better way in which to do things, you can't because of the way in which this one corporation is going to shut down competition. Right? The problem or the reality is that when you put these kinds of arguments out there, you may intend for something to happen. The reality is sometimes quite different. And the best example from that is with the meatpacking industry. Hopefully you guys have all had your breakfast and won't be nauseated too much by this. Most of the meatpacking centers, Chicago, New Orleans, Kansas City, etc., were fairly similar in the sense that they were disassembly processes. The pig goes in, and they used to say they would process everything but the point. Right? These animals would go in and be butchered and be turned into consumer pieces of meat. There was an investigative journalist by the name of Upton Sinclair who looks at the Chicago meatpacking industry. His purpose for writing this is really twofold. On the one hand, he wants to expose, we're eating this food, how is it being handled? Right? But more importantly to Sinclair, he was following a family. It was a mythical family where he kind of made them up, right? Fictional. Where they were a recent immigrant, they're playing by all the rules, they're saving money, they're trying to buy a house, they're trying to put their kids through school, but they're going to be kind of chewed up by the system, by the way in which, they're working 12-hour work shifts. The kid, the littlest child in the family, a little 18-year-old girl, is literally going to drown in the backyard cesspool because there was no sewage disposal in the region where these folks were living. The purpose of Upton Sinclair was to say, look at how these workers are being abused. What did most of the readers see? What they saw were the ways in which these foods were processed. Right? So he has one idea about what is good, the writer. The people who are reading it are going to see something different. What they're going to remember are stories like what he translates are when you're butchering an animal, there's a lot of blood. Blood apparently is very slippery. I don't work around standing in a lot of blood. Right? You're working 12 hours a day with razor-sharp knives. What's eventually going to happen? You're going to cut yourself. Oh my God! There's human blood in the food that's going into the sausage. What are you supposed to do if you got human blood in there? Well, let's stop the line. Let's clean this thing up. Let's disinfect. It's blood, right? Shove it in there. There was an example of somebody literally cutting a finger off. Pretty common occurrence. Into the sausage, right? Let's stop the presses. No, they don't stop the presses. Let's just grind it on through. One of the workers was so tired from working dual shifts, he fell into the boiling vats and became someone's breakfast, right, a couple of months later. This is from a book on Chicago meatpacking industry that I read that was different from this. My favorite example, they used to dump the carcasses in the Chicago River. And in Chicago, they literally reversed the direction of the river, so all the crap flowed downstream, downstate Illinois. I hate Chicago, right? But it's basically sewage treatment plant. But these carcasses would go into the river, and some of them would sink, and the body fats would start to float up to the surface of the Chicago River. And the entrepreneurs were going out there and skimming the surface of the river to collect these body fats to turn it into margarine, right? Well, there were other things floating in the Chicago River. It is the sewer of the city of Chicago. And the concern wasn't over the health of the people who were consuming that margarine. It was the meatpacking plants who slapped an injunction on these people because they're saying, those are our carcasses that we're dumping out there. That's our butter that we should be able to get. If you're a consumer, what are you worried about? Are you worried about the exploitation of the workers? Right? It's all about a workday and trying to live the American dream and it wasn't possible. Or are you more concerned about the kind of food that you're putting into your mouth? This is a classic example of progressivism, right? It's a moral, it's an ethical question. What's bad here? And everyone's going to have a different interpretation. You asked Upton Sinclair, he would say it's bad the way these workers are being treated. Most Americans responded by saying, no, it's bad to have that kind of stuff in the food that we're selling. In 1906, the federal government passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. To have what? To have federal inspectors come in, like this guy, hey, is that a finger, Hal? What's in this sausage here, right? What do we have here? To make sure that the food and the over-the-counter medications that were being sold are unadulterated, right? The drug part of it is sort of interesting. Everyone, the kind of urban legend about Coca-Cola having cocaine. There was a lot of barbiturates and opiates in the over-the-counter medicine. My favorite were the teething medicines. Anybody that live around a baby, teeth start coming in, they're all fancy and crazy. One of the best remedies for that in the Gilded Age was to give them a teething medication with a bunch of basically opiates in it, right? Baby felt fine. A little Jimi Hendrix baby was, yeah, dude, my 2 cards, right? You're 7 years old, for God's sakes. Get over this. Those kinds of products were now going to be regulated. Why? Why regulate them? Gilded Age would say, hey, it's your own damn fault if you're buying stuff. Because it's good, because a modern society recognizes we're going to have large meatpacking plants. A modern society doesn't go back and say, well, why don't we all just slaughter our own animals? Why don't we all live on a farm? Why don't we all grow our own vegetables? That is no longer a possibility in a modern world. No more today than it was then. And the progressive era is coming to terms with that. Is finding ways in which to reach some sort of middle ground. Right? So seeing the problem is an important component that all of these groups do. A second approach is to organize, to create an interest group. National Association for the Advancement of Television, NAACP, perfect example of that. In New York City, a group of whites and blacks and others, men and women, are going to form an organization to do what? To march, to raise legislation, to run candidates? No, to raise the awareness of what is going on in the United States in regards to race. Right? Are they left, right, center? It doesn't matter. They're processing, in essence, this information to put forward an argument to the American public. We're going to get back to W.E.B. Du Bois later on. We talk about this period of time and the changes in kind of racial animosity in the country. Booker Washington, down in the South, everything's great. We're going to co-op, we're going to accommodate. W.E.B. Du Bois is saying, when you have, 1,200 African Americans lynched a year, which was the average in the 1880s and 1890s, almost 2,000 people lynched in this country a year. Raising awareness on this issue is a critical thing. You think today, National Rifle Association, what do? They raise awareness on Second Amendment gun rights. It's the exact same thing. Right? To counter it, on the one side you've got the NAACP, National Association of Manufacturing, about the most conservative group you can possibly find, does exactly the same thing. They become an interest group, they become a lobbyist, they become an organization that is pushing forward to get their issues on the national agenda. Right? Is this something new in American politics? Well, not according to the founders. Right? James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, who's trying to promote the ratification of the Constitution, is one of 3 authors to write something called the Federalist Papers. And if you're an American who understands the Constitution, you've got to be aware of those federalists. James Madison basically says, that's the nature of American politics. What's going to keep us healthy is that all of these interests are going to come forward. People are going to really push and say, this is an important issue for me. Right? National Association of Manufacturers, NAACP, my favorite classic example of progressive interest group politics, Women's Christian Temperance Union. Right? Frances Willard, you don't want to invite her to your next kegger, let me just tell you that. Right? She thinks that we're so, you think about the progressive loop. They're optimistic enough to think that human beings will stop drinking alcohol. Right? That they will put it aside. Why? Because we're smart enough to realize that we're just wasting our money on a pursuit, on a depressant, drug that's going to blah, 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 blah. Right? They actually passed at the federal level a law, a constitutional amendment, that prohibits the sale, distribution, and manufacture, I guess in different orders, of alcoholic beverages. Right? How progressive is that? The idea that somehow we can use the society that we live in to prevent things that are bad for us. Is it idealistic? Yeah. Is it an absolute lost cause? Yeah. Right? Anytime you have these kinds of morality prohibitions on drugs or alcohol, people who want them will find a way. And all it does is to create a subculture. Right? In essence, what you do is you create an entire subculture of gang violence in the United States around prohibition. So all of these are examples of what? Of creating an organization to put pressure on society to act on these issues. Right? See the problem, act on the problem by creating an interest group, and then change the environmental conditions that exist. In education, John Dewey. Dewey is someone who is going to look at the education system and say, the traditional rote memorization, sitting down and memorize and repeat, right, is not tapping into young people's natural curiosity. And he's here talking about what we would call today K through 12, like K through 8 more than anything else. And if you've ever been around young people, you know they're naturally curious. They're poking around, they're flipping things over, they're looking at stuff. And what Dewey says is, let's take advantage of that natural curiosity. These aren't just simply little adults. These are different developmentally. And subsequently, studies of children recognize that the brains are different. They haven't developed. Your frontal cortex, right now, if you're 18 to 22, your frontal cortex is still not developed yet. Right? So remember that as you're, doing what Frances Willard would say not to do, right? Killing those brain cells, right? And what does that mean? It means you're physiologically different than an old fart like me. Right? My brain's dying at this point in time. Right? It's holding on as best as it can. Yours is still growing. The point is that looking at that reality, looking at the world in a modern viewpoint, and saying we need to change the way in which we assume how society has worked. The old ways are not always the best ways. And one of the philosophical principles around this is something called pragmatism. And most people think pragmatism, old Uncle Henry is very pragmatic. And usually what it means is that they're not book learned and they're just kind of common sense wisdom. Pragmatism really means, it's ironic in the sense that the real definition of the word means test and analyze. To be pragmatic means you test something, you review those results, and you act according to those precepts. The same thing is true in terms of the way in which you're going to change education systems in the United States. The big thing that Dewey is going to look at is seeing the child, is seeing the fact that these individuals are not just little human beings, but rather, what? Developmentally different than adults. And if you want something, you look at American history, exceptionalism, what makes us unique. One of the things that makes the United States unique, and it really is sad given the trajectory of the United States over the last 25 years, is that we have always been, since this period of time, the last 125 years have been ahead of the rest of the planet on this idea of educating our electorate. Educating, public education. You pay for that because later on it has an effect in society. And Dewey and these progressives are a big part of that. Don't allow these kids to go to work. I mean, all you're doing is taking the, who knows what kind of executives they might become, what kind of leaders they might become, what kind of clerics they might become. If you burn them out because they're working in a mine shaft, you're not going to be able to take advantage of that in American society. And the United States has historically been very much at the forefront of public education. And again, that kind of concept has been under assault for the last 25, 30 years. These progressive movements kind of, you see the changed environment, specifically Jane Addams. Jane Addams focuses on urban women, working class women, and particularly immigrant women. And here you have Jane Addams, interesting. She's a very wealthy woman, right? Comes from a wealthy family from Cedarville, Illinois. She goes to college in the 1880s, pretty radical for women. She goes back to Cedarville and she has two options. Either be a spinster, not get married, or marry somebody that dad sets her up with. And she chooses neither. She and several other women like her, college educated, optimistic, do what? They settle in the worst regions of industrial cities like Chicago, New York, Cleveland, Cincinnati, etc. They go down into the environment that exists and try to help the conditions, change the conditions. If you're a working woman with children, one of the biggest problems is, what do? Do you go for the money, or do you focus on the child? She's trying with these settlement houses to find ways to develop a middle ground. Right? And when you see her early kind of connection, I love some of these pictures here, you know, kind of the common theme here, focusing on children and child development. But in particular, these, you know, we're going to weigh your baby, we're going to wash your baby. You think I'm washing babies, right? And, you know, if you think about it, it carries a lot of bias, right? A good mother has clean babies. A bad mother has dirty babies. Well, where do these people live? They live in the dirtiest sections of town. The idea of keeping anything clean is almost absurd, and it gives it, again, that taste of how progressivism has this ethical component to it. That different people will read it different ways. Right? And it's a critical component in terms of the way in which this is going to unfold. Right? All of these are following a similar pattern. What do the settlement houses focus on? They're focusing on providing services that change the environmental conditions. Teach immigrant women how to speak English. Take care so that they know their children are being, you know, at least looked after while they're at work. Find ways in which they can educate themselves and get out of the lowest paying, lowest skilled jobs in America. Right? That's changing the environmental conditions. That's not handing things out. That's turning around and saying, in essence, we're going to try and help you to develop a new way to live in a modern world. Because you can't go back. You can't go back, I won't just go raise chickens or something like that. Not in modern America. Right? It doesn't work that way. And the historical development. Corpus Christi, I'd like to finish with this. Ellis Scott is doing the exact same thing here in Corpus. And some of the most progressive community organizers are in Texas. Galveston after the major hurricane. Right? Dallas, Houston, Corpus Christi are doing what? Are changing the environmental conditions and finding ways in which to bring people into the political process. That's what social gospel progressives kind of have in common. Seeing the problem, seeing the problem that fundamental conditions exist. You can dress up like you're an old revolutionary with a three-cornered hat or whatever. You can pretend you're Abe Lincoln, you know, do a reconstruction of the 1840s. That is no longer the world we live in. We're not afraid of that. We're not, oh my God, I got to work for a corporation someday. But we recognize that those conditions create certain problems. What they're arguing is that you see those in modern America. You raise the awareness of people by saying, this is the problem as I see it. Doesn't mean that everybody listens to you 100%. It creates a discussion, it creates a dialogue, it creates a debate. And trying to focus on changing the conditions that exist. You hear that term, grassroots activism. That's what social gospel progressives are about. Not running for office, not being politicians, but influencing the political process. As we go forward in the 20th century, these groups are going to form the backbone of political coalitions that are going to exist throughout the 20th century, for Republicans and Democrats. Moral Majority is a social gospel progressive group. National Association of Manufacturers, NAACP, Organization of Teachers. Right? These are interest group politics that are going to take a role using this kind of model. Right? They're the most diverse group. And I always like to see it. When you put the NRA and the Sierra Club in one group, it's a pretty diverse group. Right? And so keep in mind that diversity, when looking at it, it's not left-right, it's not Republican-Democrat, it's not ideological, although the groups themselves can be. It is a process that you're going to see repeated throughout the country. And it becomes, in essence, the dominant form of the United States political organization. Okay, questions about that group? Again, they're the most diverse. And as a result, they're the ones that really kind of cause the most confusion. A second group of progressives, national or federal progressives, are going to do what? They're going to use the federal government. They're going to use the power of the Constitution of the United States. Again, back to the first day of class. What does it mean to be an American? We're studying American history. It's not a region, it's not a race, it's not a language, it's not a religion. It's a Constitution. And in essence, what we're going to see are politicians who are going to look to that Constitution and say, it requires us to act in a certain way. Again, I've said this before in regards to gun rights. You don't have to ask to have a gun in this country. The Second Amendment guarantees it. You don't have to ask to be able to have your freedom of speech. The First Amendment guarantees it. You don't have to ask to have illegal, no illegal searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment guarantees it. The argument of national progressives is that we've been a local society throughout this period of time. It's been in Texas or Corpus Christi or Louisiana or Chicago or something like that. But the world in which we live in, modern world, connected by railroads, all of this interconnectivity, now we're in a global society, requires a more firm national stance. And the poster child for national progressives, although as we're going to see, every one of the politicians, almost every one of the politicians we're going to be talking about, are going to be in this same stripe. He's one of my favorites, Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican. Right? Roosevelt is going to be born from a very influential and kind of privileged background. He comes from money. He's a middle son, kind of sickly as a boy. As he grows up, and very intelligent, right? He's a smart kid, likes to read a lot, but he realizes that one of the things that distinguishes him as an American is his action, right? He's the youngest president we ever had, younger than anyone, Barack Obama or JFK or any of those types. And he kind of carries that animism, that sense of the United States as a young, aggressive, powerful country. He loves to hunt. He loves the Wild West. His favorite sport is boxing. Actually, he loses the use of one of his eyes because he's boxing as president. How'd you like that? To be able to go up and box with the president. He does have something of a unique vision of the United States, and there's not, as with any human being, not everything about this guy is good or bad, at least from my interpretation. But one of the things he does have is the youth and energy associated. You catch that with some of these film clips. Most of the time you see Teddy Roosevelt, you see an old Roosevelt. He's a young guy. He's somebody you look around and say, that's, he's out in the wild, wild west. Right? One of my favorites is that, he would go out to Montana. His favorite place to go out in the west is Montana. And he was somewhat of a kind of an amateur naturalist, so he'd go out in the west. He carried with him two things. First of all, a pearl-handled revolver, which, George S. Patton saw. He said that's what kids carry, right? A pearl-handled revolver. And he wore baby blue chaps, right? Chaps are the things that cowboys wear. Right? They were baby blue, right? And he had the nickname of the Dude. Today the Dude is kind of, dude, everybody, the dude this, dude that's kind of a slang. It's a good thing. Back in the day, being a dude wasn't the best thing. It was being it was being somebody who's a poser, somebody who's kind of slumming around in the West. When he forms a company to fight in the Spanish-American War in Cuba and puts his ass on the line, he's literally, bullets are flying past TR's head. He's going to take the two toughest groups of people that he sees in American society. Western cowboys. Does anyone want to guess who the other group is? Toughest men in American society? Workers? Not workers. Football players. Right? And with all deference to Dr. Culver, American football players, right? And where are all these coming from? Where are the best schools? This is always a shocker. This was in 1888. The best schools were Ivy League. Yale, Harvard. Right? Those are the best football players. So the Rough Riders, when we get to them, are going to be made up of these unique American guys, cowboys and football players. Those are the two that he's going to be pulling from. And he's talking about something which is critical to understanding the progressive. And it's something I would argue, here's Blanqui talking as an American citizen rather than a historian, I would argue we've lost from our national dialogue, and that is the right to be wrong. Right? People make mistakes. If you are looking for someone who is infallible, keep looking, because it's going to be a long, long time. And what Roosevelt is going to argue is that we're going to experiment. We're going to try things. If they work, great. If not, we'll fix them. But as a politician, they're not afraid to get things wrong. They're not afraid to make a mistake, turn back on a position that they once had. And you know as well as I do, that dominates our political discussion right now. Mitt Romney's a flip-flopper. John Kerry's a flip-flopper. Obama did this and said that. Okay? kind of part of the progressive movement is saying, yeah, that's the part of making mistakes. You're not going to be batting 100%, right? And TR kind of articulates that in a very powerful way. Roosevelt is going to come to power as president because of assassination. He is William McKinley's vice president. And when McKinley is assassinated in 1901, Teddy Roosevelt becomes the youngest president in American history, a record which is held to this day. What he is going to argue, what Woodrow Wilson is going to argue, what William Howard Taft is going to argue, what Eugene Debs is going to argue, is that what it means to be an American is not living in Little Corpus Christi or Nueces County, but rather you are part of a national society. And that national society is defined by the Constitution. They're arguing, you disagree with this, right? They're arguing that focusing on the Constitution is a positive good. That is the way in which big countries, modern countries, countries that have industrialized, are organized the most efficient, the best way. Right? I mean, politically, you can turn around and, oh, that's bullshit. I think we should be local, the 10th Amendment, all that kind of stuff. That's great. Right? It's a counter-argument. This is the argument the national progressives are making. They promote the formation of regulatory agencies, not because they want to get their hands in everything, but because they realize, or argue, again, I want to make sure to put this in a neutral setting, that the United States isn't a malfunctioning corporation, like Gordon Gekko says, but it is a state with a constitution. Citizens are not the same as workers. Right? You want to guarantee every worker the right to carry arms? You want to guarantee that a worker, everyone has a jury trial? If you're going to get fired by your boss, can you demand a jury trial? No. They're two separate things. Both of the political parties throughout the 20th century and continuing now in the 21st century follow this same model. George W. Bush brought the same group. Right? By and large, what Republicans today are arguing for, and even at this point in time, is order, a sense of predictability. You don't want the market to be doing this all the time because you can't predict. You don't know how to invest. Should I buy gold? Should I buy stock? Should I hire new workers? Should I lay off workers? You want some sense of predictability. Being able to regulate the market is going to help that predictability, the money supply. Right? Democrats, by contrast, are going to argue that there's excesses in the marketplace that the market can be held in check on. You know, if you don't do anything, the minimum wage could drop to nothing. Is that the world in which we want to live in? If you don't do anything, you know, you can bank and you know, have all kinds of sweetheart deals and backroom deals. Is that the world in which we want to live in? That's the debate. Right? It isn't whether to regulate or not to regulate. The question is why regulate? What is the purpose in regulation? And if you look at this in the grand scheme of political ideologies from the far left to the far right, they're pretty similar parties. Right? And everybody gets uncomfortable with that. Oh no, Democrats hate Democrats. I hate Republicans. And the reality is when you look at what they do over the next 120 years, it's pretty much debating whether the tax rate should be 34% or 32%. You know, that's what the debate is about, even today. Percentages, right? 5% this way, 10% that way. Right? So this argument is going to be part of both of the political parties. Roosevelt's going to put this on display almost immediately. There's a strike that breaks out in 1902. It's not going to be settled until 1903. It is dealing with one of the best organized, the most effectively organized unions in the United States, and that's the Coal Mining Union. United Coal Miners Union of America. Right? They're going to go out on strike for the same reasons we've been talking about: 8-hour workday, fair wages, health concerns, etc. The problem is, at least in this condition, is that what these miners are pulling out of the ground is something called anthracite coal, hard coal, a purer coal. Coal is, we got more coal underneath the American land than everyone's got oil in the world put together. Right? So we got a ton of natural resources when it comes to coal. But there's not as much of the anthracite coal, hard coal. It doesn't have the impurities. It burns hotter, and it burns cleaner and more consistently. Now, if you're cooking pancakes, do you need to have your skittle up to 1200 degrees? No. But if you're making steel, if your alloys require a high temperature, anthracite coal is essential. If this strike continues, what's going to happen? High industry, most of the manufacturing jobs in the country are going to be affected by this. The middle class is going to be affected by this. When they go out on strike, by and large, the government kind of ignores them. Yeah, strike, fine, whatever. We've seen this before in the Gilded Age. The owners of the mines basically kind of spout the gospel of wealth. God has put us in this position. We're going to tell you what the conditions are. And if you don't like it, leave. Don't take a job here. We're not going to have any regulation on this. Roosevelt changes the equation by saying, I'm going to provide, as representative of the federal government, I'm going to provide a square deal. I'm going to be an honest broker. I'm going to bring these two parties to Washington, and we will find a middle way. Right? Oh, that's socialism. Well, that's how they settled the football strike. That's what they did for the NFL. The reason why there was an NFL season this year was because of federal arbitration. It's the exact same thing. When Roosevelt makes this offer, the unions are there in about 20 seconds. Hell, it's better than getting baited, right? Better than having local guys come at you and say, well, we're going to power the state's going to shut this down. The owners of the mines say, to hell with you, you're just the president of the United States. We're not going to show up. And Roosevelt threatens to reopen the mines and nationalize them. That is socialism. That is taking property. But his argument is, this is too important for the nation as a whole. We are too integrated as an economy to have this one issue shut down the entire American economy. Right? And it's using the power of the presidency, using the bully pulpit in Roosevelt's terminology, to be able to pull this off. Okay. When we get back on Friday, I'll kind of conclude this group in terms of their approach to business. Make sure and let me know if you got questions about the precipice. It's an important issue.